for Academic Affairs, and very, very pleased to see not only so many of you here, but also people from such a great range of departments and colleges throughout the university. Like we do with many of these presentations in this series, this one is co-hosted by my office and another academic unit, and in this case it's the College of Communication, Information, and Media. But more specifically, this is a lecture made possible by the hard work and zeal of Professor Dom Christie in the Department of Telecommunications, and I want to acknowledge all of Dom's fine work and join me in a round of applause. It's now my very great pleasure to introduce this morning's featured speaker, Joel Brinkley, reporter, editor, and Pulitzer Prize-winning foreign correspondent. Mr. Brinkley is a native of Washington, D.C., and a 1975 graduate of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. In the 1970s and early 1980s, he began his journalistic career working for the Associated Press, the Richmond, Virginia News Leader, and the Louisville Courier-Journal. Professional recognition came early. In 1979, he was dispatched to Southeast Asia to cover the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia, the Pol Pot genocide, and the resulting refugee crisis. For this coverage, he won the Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting. After joining the Washington Bureau of the New York Times in 1983, he covered the American involvement in Lebanon, international drug trafficking, and the Contra War in Nicaragua, among other important international issues. He was the Washington editor of the paper's coverage of the Iran-Contra affair and the White House correspondent during the final years of the Reagan administration. In March of 1988, Mr. Brinkley was named chief of the Times Bureau in Jerusalem, where he served from the beginning of the Palestinian uprising through the Gulf War. In 1991, he returned to the Times Washington Bureau to become project editor, and in 1995 moved to New York, where he held several reporting and editing positions. These included political editor, editor in charge of the coverage of the TWA crash of Flight 800, and reporter columnist covering the nation's transition to digital television. Early in 1998, he returned to the Times Washington Bureau, again where he continued reporting on digital television and other technology issues. Over his career, Mr. Brinkley has won more than a dozen national journalism and writing awards, and he's also the author of 2 books, a novel, The Circus Master's Mission, and Defining Vision, the Battle for the Future of Television. This morning he'll speak on the latter topic in a presentation entitled Defining Our Digital Future. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Joel Brinkley to Ball State University.
Good morning, and thank you. I'm delighted to be here. But judging from that introduction, you all are probably expecting me to be condescending and arrogant and patronizing and maybe even self-important, but usually I'm only able to offer about 2 out of 4. I'm sorry. I'm here this morning to talk about one of the most important but least understood communications revolutions to sweep this country in several generations, one that will in time affect every single person in this room, in this city, and this nation. It is the nation's transition to digital television. Now, all of this is pretty important stuff, and you might wonder what in my background offers me the experience to opine on great issues and weighty issues like these. Well, I do have certain experiences that have enabled me to write about technology, not just my book on this subject. Years ago, for example, early in my career, I worked in southern U.S. and learned some of the reporting rules that serve me well today. For example, sometimes the tortured means of making progress in electronics labs reminds me of the way they weigh hogs in eastern Kentucky. They put a hog on one end of a balance and a seesaw sort of thing. Then they pile rocks on the other side until the 2 sides balance. Then they try to guess how much the rocks weigh. Of course, we're going to be talking about important companies, international commerce, and corporate chieftains, so you might imagine and wonder what gives me qualifications here. I do have some experience covering heads of state. I was White House correspondent, as you heard, during the final year or so of the Reagan administration, though at times the Oval Office seemed vacant. As Reagan's term ended, I was transferred to Israel, where right away I wrote a profile for the New York Times Magazine of the Prime Minister then, a fellow named Yitzhak Shamir. I spent a lot of time with the man and found him to be rather unappealing on a personal level, a humorless little fellow. Well, you can't say it just like that in the newspaper. But I think I made note of the fact that Mr. Shamir was not blessed with a great wit, soothing public manner, or that he was not particularly tall. Well, it happened that the Israeli press loved to pick up what we wrote in the Times, and sometimes there were translation errors. So, the next morning, the newspaper Hadashot wrote across 6 columns, "New York Times calls Shamir a stupid dwarf." That caused me just a little trouble, as you might imagine. Serving abroad, I missed most of the Bush administration. So did Bush, some might argue. But I was political editor during the last campaign, and I know Bob Dole quite well, and I wouldn't have missed that election campaign for anything. It was Dr. Kevorkian's first effort as a campaign manager. We'll see who he works for this time. Well, I think I'm straying from my subject. I guess I haven't gotten to my subject. Today is a big day in the nation's transition to digital television. Today, November 1st, every television station in the nation's 30 largest cities that have network affiliates, ABC, NBC, CBS, and Fox, must turn on their digital channels. That includes Indianapolis, the only one in this state. That is supposed to bring about 120 digital stations on the air. That's an important moment. But what is digital broadcasting? Before we examine this, let me step back for a minute and explain what we're talking about. Digital broadcasting is a new form of broadcasting that at its most basic level sends TV signals through the air in digital form, the ones and zeros of computer code. Why is that important? The beauty of digital signals is that they can be compressed the way analog today's signals cannot. That means that you can fit more things in the same space on the airwaves, and you can subdivide the signal and send more than just television pictures. All of this means that your television set can suddenly become a terribly important communications instrument, not just a dumb box transmitting pictures and sound alone. With digital broadcasting, televisions can offer high-definition TV, which is television so sharp and clear it looks almost real. Properly done, it can make you gasp. But with digital television, the industry can also begin to offer you all sorts of new, advanced, interactive services. They can send you web pages on your TV, advertising, stock quotes. You can interact and choose the programming you want, all sorts of things that nobody has yet even conceived of. And the truth is, the transition to digital television is one of those rare national events that affects everyone, every one of you. And the reason is that it's mandatory. The government is forcing this. There's no choice, which means that this transition will affect more people than the current debate over managed care in Washington, more people than the federal budget under discussion right now, more people than next year's presidential election in a lot of ways, more people than Monica Lewinsky's cigar fetish or almost anything else we can think of. The reason is that 99% of the nation's homes have at least one television set, maybe more homes than have telephones, more homes than have flush toilets. And over the next decade or so, every one of those homes, every one of your homes, is going to have to replace those TVs with new digital models. There's no choice. It's a government mandate, and this is a pretty much unprecedented event in this country. The first time a national technology transition is being driven by government decree. No one was forced to trade his horse for a car, his Victrola for a radio, his radio for a TV, or a typewriter for a PC. But this time it's mandatory and it's already underway. Under the government's rule, analog television, all the TV stations we are watching right now every day, all these stations are supposed to go off the air forever in just 6 years, replaced by the new digital channels that are just starting up right now. And most people don't even know it, just 6 years. That means that within 6 years, all of you are supposed to buy a new digital TV or 2 or 3, or a converter box for your existing analog TVs. Maybe several of them, or under this plan you lose the ability to watch television. Now, most people believe that the federal deadline is unrealistic and will be pushed back, and my own opinion is that I cannot see one member of Congress who will vote to turn off his constituents' televisions. But sooner or later the axe will fall. It has to, because there's just too much money at stake. Sooner or later the transition will be complete. The government will turn off the old channels and leave you with only the new ones because they have already counted the revenue from auctioning those old channels in future budget projections. That's how we have a balanced budget in this country, by putting into it things like that that are future projections about money they may or may not get. Well, as I say, sooner or later it will happen, but I would say later, because so far the transition to digital TV isn't really going very well. It's been 1 year today since the transition began. The first stations, about 25 of them, went on the air voluntarily November 1st, 1998. And already analysts and pundits are calling this a failure. I don't agree with that, but it is true that most people still don't know anything about this. That shouldn't really be surprising, and it's not just because the digital television sets on sale in most stores around the country cost at least $4,000. Here's what else is going on. It's true right now that more than 100 DTV stations are on the air today. In Washington, where I live, 7 stations are broadcasting right now, 6 of them full-time. Of course, more stations are on in Washington because the broadcasters want members of Congress to see that they're serious. But many of these other 120 stations that are supposed to go on today have announced to the FCC that they're likely to be delayed because they can't find a place to put the tower and the new antenna. The tower that holds their present antenna is full. They ran out all the space to cell phone providers and so forth. So there's no place to put the antenna. So lots of places around the country, they have to build a new TV tower. Now, in many cities, originally the TV tower sat right in the middle of the town, but new zoning rules require that a tower be on a piece of property big enough so it can fall over without hitting anything. And they can't find pieces of property that big. So that's one of the big delays that is causing some of these stations not to go on the air. But even the stations that are on the air aren't offering much that anybody really wants to see at this point. Most are offering little or no high-definition television, which the manufacturers of the TVs think is the one service that will draw people to buy these expensive sets, and no advanced services. The programs are, by and large, simply digital copies of the analog shows on the other channel. You could switch back and forth and not tell much difference after having spent $4,000 for this new TV set. CBS and ABC are broadcasting several hours of HDTV in prime time right now. They're doing it because the manufacturers of television sets paid them to do it, so that somebody had a motivation to come buy the TVs. In fact, much of CBS's primetime schedule this year is high definition. But even when the networks do broadcast something in high definition, there's no way to know. There's nothing in the TV guide about it, no on-air promotion, nothing. Few of you are likely to remember the days in the late 50s and 60s when NBC would precede Bonanza or Walt Disney with the announcement that this program is being shown in full living color, and the NBC Peacock would spread its colorful wings on the screen. There's nothing like that today. You have to guess. On the other side, a year into the transition, most television manufacturers are now selling these digital TV sets, but after more than a year of sales, only 50,000 of them have been sold. Think about that. In this country, 25 million television sets are sold every year. 50,000. The industry sold more black and white TVs during that period. I'm not surprised. It's not just the price. The retailers, it turns out, aren't really interested in selling these things. They think nobody's going to come in and spend this money, so they put them up and say, there's a digital television set, but you don't want it. Why don't you come over and buy this fancy analog TV instead? You have years before you have to worry about digital television. Well, if the retail industry continues pushing the public away from this transition, how interested are consumers going to be to buy this stuff when the prices are more realistic? But even if you can get a salesman to sell you one of these sets and you do buy one, owning an HD TV is not easy. I know firsthand. Panasonic loaned me one for a story I was writing a year ago in October 1998, and it turned out they told me that I was the first consumer in the United States of America to have a DTV in his home. And that was a thrill, but it was also a challenge. The first problem was getting the damn thing into my house. Almost every manufacturer is making huge rear projection TVs that are the size of a city bus. They are monsters. The Panasonic monitor was more than 4 feet tall, 4 feet wide, 3 feet deep, and weighed in at 251 pounds. And this is hardly the biggest of them. The largest Mitsubishi model is more than 6 feet tall, 5 feet wide, and 5 feet deep. Gazing at it, you're looking for the door so you can get in and drive it away. Well, as a two-man delivery team struggled to get this thing off the truck to my house, Preston Padden's remark came to mind. Last year, when he was president of ABC Television, he remarked, "These first-generation sets, you're going to need a crane to get them into your living room. Why, one of them I saw was 8 feet wide and 5 feet deep. You'll have to lay a foundation slab and build your house around it." Well, in this case, my house was already built. But it did turn out that the delivery squad couldn't get the monitor down the steps into the room specially designed for this. And as the TV sat in my yard, honest to God, there was a discussion of using a crane. I said no. Instead, I didn't like this idea either, but huffing and puffing, they heaved the damn thing into my living room. My wife loved that. And as soon as the set was rolled into place, the room's center of gravity seemed to shift. Well, once we got adjusted to this new landscape, I set out to hook up the digital tuner box to the digital television set. They're separate now. You buy a tuner box and hook it up to your display. Then I hooked the box to my rooftop antenna, installed for just this purpose. To get 21st century television, you need technology from the 1950s. A rooftop antenna, preferably with a rotor box. Right now, HDTV isn't available from any other source. So I turned the antenna toward WHD-TV, the model station, the industry model station, which was the only one on the air back then. Then I tuned the tuner box to channel 30, WHD, so that the first digital high-definition set in a consumer's home could show absolutely nothing. So I called Panasonic. I work for the New York Times after all. I called Panasonic, several engineers in the lab that designed the box, and asked them what was wrong. And they told me, you know, digital signals are funny. You have to turn the antenna, you know, about 20, 30 degrees away from right on to get a signal. Well, I certainly would not have thought of that. And presumably, most buyers of this box are not going to be able to call up the engineers who designed it. But sure enough, with the antenna turned about 20 degrees from straight on, the TV did pick up a signal of sorts. WHD was airing a digital high-definition tape of a recent Duke, North Carolina football game, and I'm a North Carolina graduate, I was interested. But on the monitor, the Duke quarterback was stuck, frozen in the middle of throwing a pass, his hand jerking back and forth spasmodically like a stuck toy. Well, as the engineer had put it, digital signals are funny. On the air of a clear reception area, the signal doesn't just grow fuzzier and fuzzier, as it does with analog TV, a phenomenon in the industry known as graceful degradation. Instead, digital signals are either perfect or you get nothing at all. They freeze. This is called the cliff effect. Perfect, and then you fall off the cliff. Well, finally, with careful adjustment of the antenna rotor, the picture unfroze and the game played on. And sure enough, it looked just great, crystal clear and beautiful, just what I'd hoped for. But it turned out, though, that over several days, there wasn't much high-definition material for WHD to put on the air. So they had to play that football game over and over again. And I already know that my school lost. So I wasn't really much interested in watching it. So I called up Bruce Miller, the station manager at WHD, and asked him if he'd mind putting on a movie for me. I was the only viewer. So I was hoping for something like video on demand from my TV station. And sure enough, he agreed. And he listed for me the 5 high-definition movies they had on hand, and I selected Lawrence of Arabia for the historical symmetry because it turned out that was the first movie ever broadcast in high definition back in 1996. But I later learned that at 3.5 hours it was too long. The station shut down every day at 6 p.m. and somebody would have to stay late to turn everything off. So they played Sleepless in Seattle instead. And it looked splendid. It was really nice. But about halfway through the movie, the screen went blank. Well, I wondered what had happened. Had the prototype tuner shorted out? Had the antenna slipped a half a degree off of 20 degrees off of plumb or whatever? I don't know. But as I later learned that midway through the movie, one of the station's technicians had to change over to the second reel. Well, That was a year ago, before things really got serious, and things are serious today. I wrote about this for the Times, and a Panasonic executive called me up and said, well, we thought it was kind of amusing, but we're kind of afraid that it might scare people off from buying these sets. Well, no wonder. Truth is that a year later, things haven't changed very much. I sometimes do equipment reviews for the Times, take in products and look at these DTVs and see how they work, and it's still a trial getting a signal. The direct broadcast satellite companies like DirecTV say they are going to begin offering some high-definition programming, but no one is taking advantage of that because there aren't any tuner boxes available that allow direct broadcast subscribers to get the high-definition shows. And no one anywhere is yet taking advantage of some of the other advanced services of digital television, the interactivity and educational services and variety of advanced things that are promised. Nobody's yet figured it out. PBS says they plan to use some interactivity with their shows, but they haven't done it yet. Meanwhile, most cable systems refuse to carry any of the broadcasters' high-definition or digital programming, and 70% of people get all their shows off of cable. So 70% of people can't get these shows anyway, even if they have a DTV. The cable companies complain that if they put on the digital programming, they'll have to knock off other shows, and of course it's called the Washington Monument Strategy here in Washington. They say, we'll have to cut off C-SPAN, or we'll have to cut off, the McNeil-Lehrer Report, or things that then what congressmen care about. That's the Washington Monument Strategy, because when there's a budget negotiation, the White House or Congress says, if you cut that, we'll have to shut down the Washington Monument. Well, we'll see. The FCC is supposed to rule on this and probably will force the cable companies to carry some of it. A few months ago, HBO, with great fanfare, announced that they were going to broadcast a full channel of HDTV, maybe even 2 of them. But when they turned it on, no one was watching it. Nobody anywhere. Not one consumer. None of the nation's cable companies were carrying the signal except Time Warner, which at that time was the biggest of them. Time Warner owns HBO, so Time Warner reluctantly agreed to carry HBO's signal. Time Warner, in fact, raced to get the new digital equipment in place for the first HBO high-definition broadcast with the idea that they would send a technician to anybody's home in New York City, the city where they were broadcasting it first, so they could help get anybody set up to receive the programming. By Friday night, the eve of this great inaugural broadcast, they were sending out press releases and this and that. They managed to get all the equipment in place and turned on the transmitter, but not one consumer had called. Nobody had been told. Well, even if a cable subscriber calls HBO right now in a Time Warner area and says, I want to get HBO digital, he'll find another disquieting reality. There is no way to connect a digital cable box to a high-definition television set. A year after the transition began, the consumer electronics companies and the cable companies haven't agreed on what kind of cable they're going to run from one box to the other. They're still fighting about it. A year ago, in the fall of 1998, the chairman of the FCC was so concerned about this that he ordered them to come to an agreement by November 1st, 1998. And sure enough, on October 30th, they had a grand pronouncement. We've agreed. What they had agreed to, it turned out, and everybody sort of settled into a chair and congratulated themselves and issued press releases and patted themselves on the back, but what they had agreed to was the kind of plug they would use. They hadn't agreed to how the signal would be organized and what kind of copy protection protocol would be used in sending these digital high-definition movies, and Hollywood won't release a movie in digital form until it's copy protected. Well, now it's November 1st, 1999, and they still haven't agreed. We haven't heard much from Chairman Kennard on this recently. Well, all of this may sound pretty discouraging, and it is. But remember, we're only 1 year into this transition. I was an infant then, but I have since learned that the transition to color TV was not much smoother. CBS originally had the first color system that was approved by the FCC. It used a color wheel inside your TV set, red, green, and blue, like you see in front of some Christmas trees. The color wheel would turn around real fast, and a beam of light would go through it, and so forth. And if you think about some of these big screen TVs now, you have to have a color wheel that's twice as wide as the screen to take up this whole room. Well, the FCC quickly got overtaken by RCA and Sarnoff, which created another competing system, and they overruled their decision and enacted the RCA system in 1953, and that's the one we still have today. But in 1953, the first color television set cost $1,000. It was 19 inches wide. That's $6,500 today. And at that point in that transition, and for nearly a decade after, only RCA sold color television sets, and only NBC and RCA Network broadcast color shows. And 10 years after the transition began, they still had not sold 1 million color TVs. Well, our situation today is far different. All the manufacturers are making these sets, and all the networks are broadcasting digital programming under government rule. And think about where we were at this point in another transition, big one that some of you might remember. After the first personal computer was introduced in 1981. I was an early adopter there too. I bought my first IBM PC in 1981, and I had, at that point, it was still a pretty crude instrument, I had to hand wire the printer cable using a soldering iron and a little jeweler's screwdriver and a tiny pair of needle-nose pliers, and even then, to print something, I had to buy an outboard box called a converter buffer for $250 that attached to the side of the system unit with Velcro. Well, that's how sophisticated it was at the beginning. And back then, lots of people were saying, sure, having a computer in your home is great, but what are we going to do with it? Do you want to spend $3,500 to print letters? Back then, nobody had thought of the killer app for PCs, the killer application. But they came. First it was Lotus 123, the spreadsheet program introduced in the early mid-'80s. Everybody loved that. Then came check balancing programs, and sooner or later email and the internet and everything we know on PCs today. And at this point now, almost half of American homes have a personal computer. Well, I think we're at about the same point on the curve for digital television as we were with personal computers in about 1982. We're waiting for somebody to find that killer app. And they will. There's so much money at stake. Everybody will have one of these in their home. And whoever finds the application that digital television makes possible and consumers will want will be rich beyond their wildest dreams and will be copied endlessly if they don't have a proper patent. Well, I could go on, but I think maybe the most useful thing now would be to answer some questions, any questions on this subject or any other. I've written about a lot of different things over the years. One thing I've been writing about recently is I covered the Microsoft antitrust trial, which is about to end. And I would accept questions on any subject, embarrassing or straight. But before we get to that, I want to tell one last story. You know, one thing I have learned covering this transition to digital television is that nothing has turned out as planned. Things move in unpredictable fits and starts, and actions bring consequences nobody anticipated. But that shouldn't be too surprising. I've learned that unintended consequences occur as a result of almost anything anybody does, particularly the government. But back when I was a much younger man, I wrote a series of stories in Virginia and the South about the Ku Klux Klan. I traveled around the country, the South mostly, and talked to Klan leaders and went to cross-burning rallies and met a whole host of lunatics. And when I was around these people, most of the time I was simply terrified. But near the end of my research, I went to the big National Klan rally at Stone Mountain, Georgia, just outside Atlanta, complete with burning crosses and bigots wearing hoods and capes. And as I drove onto the rally field, I was more than a bit nervous. As I wandered around, I noticed that these robed figures seemed to be staring at me with my little reporter's pad, and I could imagine the sneers and muttered curses behind their masks. Then I came upon the recruiting table where prospective Klansmen were supposed to sign up. Most of the robed figures didn't seem much interested because if you signed up, you had to pay the dues. Well, I walked right up to the table and tried to look at the names on the list to see where these people were from and how many there were. You know, that's what reporters do. And the Klansman behind the table glared at me and said, "Who the hell are you?" And in journalism, you can't lie. Can't say you are somebody you aren't, as ABC television recently learned. So I said, "I'm a newspaper reporter." And from behind me, one of the robed boys shouted, "You're from the paper? You're going to put our names in the paper?" And again, I couldn't lie, even though I figured I was about to die. And I said, "Well, maybe, unless you don't want me to." And then I waited for the press of a gun muzzle against my neck, or maybe a rope. But instead, at the very same moment, 2 or 3 of these robed boys leaped up from their folding chairs and shouted, "Hell, he's going to put our name in the paper. If we can get our name in the paper, we're all going to sign up." And I learned the next morning that I had been responsible for the most successful recruiting drive in the Ku Klux Klan's recent history, which just goes to show you unintended consequences are something to be beware of. Thank you very much.
As Joel said, he's got lots of time for questions, and we purposely set it up that way. So, David, you want to begin?
Yes, will this enable high-definition stations to become internet service providers?
The question is whether the transition will now enable digital stations to become internet service providers. In theory, the answer is yes. They can send anything they want over that space. And in fact, the chairman of the FCC a couple of weeks ago urged them to do just that. But the reaction from most broadcasters is, we don't want to do that. We're not as one of them said, I'm not the phone company. They want to sell programming and entertainment, and they don't see the internet as entertainment. They see it as competition. Now, I suspect before long some views may change on that.
You mentioned in the history of technology the comparison with the transition to color television. And at that time, there was compatibility. If you had a black and white set, you could still receive the color signals, obviously in black and white. What has happened with that compatibility theory when digital was introduced?
The question is, why are not digital sets compatible with today's sets the way color TV sets were compatible with black and white broadcasts and vice versa? When the FCC started the competition to choose a high definition system, at the beginning it was high definition. They hadn't dreamed of digital yet. Several of the proponents, the contestants, said they wanted to do a compatible system. One of them was the Sarnoff Labs, which was the RCA Labs that had made its name creating the color system. But then over time, the FCC and the various companies involved with this realized that if they carried the system from the 40s, it was designed in the 40s, to carry the system from the 40s into the 80s and 90s, they would really hobble their effort. And finally, when a company out of the blue invented something that everybody thought was impossible, and that is digital television, which everyone believed was the impossible dream, they abandoned all thought of compatibility because digital made it impossible, and digital was such a desirable goal that they realized that a transition of the sort we're talking about was worth it.
Mark?
If memory strikes me right, a few years back, Congress had taken the initiative or advice and money from American manufacturers to take the lead in development and production of HDTV sets. Did that happen? And did it pay off?
I assume everybody heard that because he was in the back. Back in the late 80s and early 90s, actually it was around 91, the National Association of Broadcasters, the lobbying group for broadcasting companies, to serve a particular lobbying aim they had, brought in a demonstration of high-definition television from Japan. Japan was the only nation that had it back then. And they played it on Capitol Hill, and a bunch of members of Congress came in. Well, it started a national frenzy. Suddenly everybody realized that the nation was behind on this terribly important piece of technology after we'd already lost the VCR and lost this and lost that to Japan. And so that started all kinds of congressional hearings and debates about paying American manufacturers and, to build high-definition television sets to try to help them catch up. Well, that was a congressional frenzy. And George Bush was president when it reached its peak, and George Bush decided it was a really bad idea, and it probably was, and he killed it. Instead, the FCC started what turned out to be a better idea, and that's the HDTV race, which set up over several years a competition among anybody who wanted to enter to create the best high-definition television set, and the government would choose the winner. And the winner, which ended up being all the contestants combined into one at the end, is the system that we have today.
On that, now after this Grand Alliance has produced this system, a group of broadcasters is saying this is not the best. There's this European system that works better. How do you think that'll play?
Part of the standard that the government has approved includes something called the transmission standard, and that is the subset of it that it organizes the signal in a way for sending it out over the airways. And there was a competition for that, and there was a competition between the Zenith Corporation and the General Instrument Corporation, and Zenith won, and their system is now incorporated. Well, it turns out that the Zenith system doesn't work very well right now. The problems I was talking about, turning the antenna 20 degrees off of center, is because the Zenith system doesn't work very well. Well, there's a company in Baltimore called Sinclair Broadcast, they own more TV stations than anybody else, that ran some informal tests showing that another transmission system in use in Europe works better, at least under the circumstances they demonstrated it. And they have petitioned the FCC to alter the standard to use this European system instead of the Zenith system. Well, it's caused a huge stink. Everybody who bought a digital television set thus far, admittedly not very many, would find that their boxes don't work anymore. It reminds me of all the people who bought CBS color TVs back in 1951. And the manufacturers say that the first generation receivers don't work very well, but they'll get a lot better, and they're sort of asking the FCC to take it on faith that that is so. But actually now, about half of the nation's TV stations have signed this petition to change the standard. If they do that, it's going to delay things for years. Now, maybe they ought to, maybe they shouldn't, I don't know. I went to see these demonstrations, and they were fairly compelling. But I don't know how it's going to turn out. The FCC would sincerely like not to do anything. But if a majority of the broadcasters say they want to do it, they sometimes feel they don't have any choice. We'll see.
Stuart?
What's a potential business model in which local TV stations can benefit from HDTV? And second question, given the experience with HDTV, do you think that will affect their approach to digital radio?
What's a potential business model for HDTV? That's a very good question because not one broadcaster has found one. There are some who believe that high definition is the way to make money. Given the cable companies' lack of interest in it, they say we want to be the premium service and offer this premium product that nobody else is going to offer. But it's very expensive to air high definition. And there's a question about whether advertisers will pay more to be shown, have their ads shown in high definition. So that's a position they're taking without any real knowledge yet of whether it will ever work, because there aren't enough receivers in people's homes to sell even one ad. On the other side, a number of broadcasters say they want to take advantage of another capability of digital broadcasting, and that is multi-channel. Instead of one high definition program which would fill up the entire channel, you can air 4 or 5 standard definition shows in the space that one analog channel takes up now. So if you watch channel 6, you could watch channel 6 A, B, C, or D, and the picture quality would be roughly equal to the quality you see on TV now. And they say, well, we can compete with cable companies this way. Well, think about that for a minute, though. Most cities have 5, 6, or 7 TV stations on the air, and usually the ones on the bottom of the ratings have almost no viewers. The TV networks and local stations can't fill up the the channels they have right now with enough programming to attract viewers to watch it, or enough advertising to support everything they do. How on earth are they going to find all this new appealing programming to fill up 4 more channels? So that is a model that some broadcasters advocate, but others think is bankrupt. And I really don't know what the answer is, but my opinion is that in the end, broadcasters will do all of it. They'll offer high definition in the evening for big events and movies and football games and things that lots of people watch. Then they can subdivide, for example, the evening news. You can watch your local news show and decide whether you want to watch traffic or sports or business. You can watch a traffic report that you choose showing only the route you take home from work. The one piece of work that a local TV station does that produces more material than they can air is news. They have acres of footage that they never have any place to air. And so multi-channel news shows seem to make a lot of sense, and then they probably could sell advertising. You know, you show the route B home from work and sell ads from people along that route. So I think over time the broadcasters are going to do all kinds of things. They'll have high definition, they'll have multi-channel broadcasting, and they'll figure out some data services that make sense and allow them to make money too. The second question was about digital radio, and I have to profess I have deliberately chosen not to get into that issue because I have too much to do already, and I've ignored all entreaties to write about it, so I'm not qualified to comment. I'm sorry.
In terms of the killer applications, where are you looking to look? Where are the creative hotbeds for this, either in the United States or around the world, do you think?
Who's going to create these killer applications? Everybody thinks their industry is going to do it. The computer industry very much wants to get into digital television by one means or another. They think all of you want to watch movies on your PC monitor. Best of luck. But I think they will come up with some applications that will make a lot of sense for a lot of people. But there's 1,600 television stations in this country, and it's up to the station's engineers to figure out how it's going to work. Now, in most television stations, the engineers are fairly well along in years and expertise and sat in the basement and nobody noticed as long as the signal was on the air. But a lot of them are getting close to retiring, and they're going to be replaced hopefully by young hotshots, and somewhere somebody's going to have some great idea. I think it's going to be the way that it worked when I was based in Israel, and the kibbutz movement was having troubles. Modern Israel didn't really like these collective farms anymore. There wasn't any economic sense to it, and they were all farmers, but not very efficient, and they were all doing the crops they'd all known how to do. Well, they were all in trouble, sort of like the engineering departments and TV stations, until one kibbutz bred a seedless watermelon, something the nation of Israel had never had. And people were driving all across the country to get these seedless watermelons, and sure enough, before you knew it, by the next crop year, every kibbutz in the country was growing seedless watermelons. Well, whatever the first engineer somewhere among these 1,600 stations finds that makes money, I can guarantee you you'll have it here, I'll have it in Washington, and everybody in the nation will have it within 6 months.
Are the digital TV signals recordable by present-day VCRs? And will the signal appear superior if viewed from a VC cassette?
Are digital signals recordable with today's VCRs, and will they look superior? The answer is no. All the VCRs all of us have in our homes today can record only analog programming. You will be able, with a converter box, to down-convert the signal and record it on your analog VCR, but in the end you'll have something that looks no better than what you record now. However, already on the market is a digital VCR, high-definition VCR. Panasonic is a company that has the first one on the market, and it uses regular, real high-end VHS tape. And it will record a high-definition signal. I've used one, and play it back, and it looks just as good as it did on the air. Right now, the first one sells for $1,000, which is pretty expensive for a VCR right now, but that's the first one, and anybody who spent $4,000, $5,000 for a digital television set probably won't blink at $1,000 for a VCR. But there are a lot of different technologies competing for this. I think you're going to find recordable high-definition DVDs within a couple of years, and I think that's the one that's going to win. But the technology hasn't yet caught up to make that possible, but it will.
Lloyd?
I don't think we ought to update the ABC Foodliner case because the courts threw out the earlier judgment, so they can still appeal if they want to.
The question is, shouldn't we update the ABC Food Line case? Well, the one where ABC reporters misrepresented themselves as they were looking in on Food Line for an investigative piece. And remind me, I believe that the latest ruling overturns any penalty for ABC. I haven't followed this as closely as I should. I suspect, though, that the attention that this got, even though ABC may not be penalized in the end, got everybody's attention in the news media, particularly broadcasters. I know I have friends working for networks where they are very careful about doing anything undercover anymore, misrepresenting themselves or not. So even though the case eventually went against Food Line, I think the warning is out there and people have paid attention.
back to digital again. As you know, public broadcasting has to convert to digital, and they're hoping to get Congress to pass a big sum of money to assist them. The question would be, what do you think the probability of Congress helping out public broadcasting in its conversion to digital? And a second part of that question is, public broadcasting is claiming that they can farm out some of the additional channels that they get in each community for revenue-producing purposes. Is that possible?
How will public broadcasting get the money from the government to pay for their transition to digital television, and will they be able to sell some of their digital spectrum, some of their free channels to other services? They will certainly get some money, and I've written about this, and I don't remember the numbers right now, but as with anything, they probably jacked up the estimate by about 20 or 30%, figuring that they'd get cut by 20 or 30%, and that's what they'll get. That's being debated, and it's being fairly seriously debated. They will get some money. Whether they'll be able to use their spectrum, some of their digital channels for other services, I think is much more questionable. The reason public broadcasting gets the money from Congress is because they are largely viewed as a nonprofit education service, and I think Congress will not feel right about allowing them to do these other things, and neither will the FCC. My guess, who knows what will happen. This doesn't really have to start till 2003 for public broadcasters, but my guess is they will not be given permission to do that.
We have lots of students here, and I'm elated that you're here, but how about a student question or two?
From a production standpoint, in the networks and the distributors of the program, how quickly are they coming along with buying the equipment so that they can produce these programs?
The question is, how quickly are stations buying the equipment they need to produce these programs? Well, the early stations, the ones on the air right now, mostly have concentrated on getting on the air and simply passing through the network's programs, and they haven't bought much local production equipment. You can do that at a station right now for about $1 million, which is a lot of money, simply passing through the digital stuff from the networks and digitizing your own shows without adding anything to them. To create a complete digital production facility is a much more expensive undertaking, and at today's prices could cost $10 million. And most TV stations realize, first of all, the prices are going to come down, they have to, and second of all, why spend $10 million now for local production when we might have 500 viewers in the city? So most stations are not spending any money for local production at this point, and from my point of view, it doesn't really make sense for them to. They will have to eventually, but I would guess that's several years down the road.
From a consumer point of view, to a person that has already seen a digital television, do you think that people are going to be disappointed with the quality of what they're seeing on TV, like what an analog TV looks like with the digital television? I've never seen a digital television before. I've never seen a high-definition television before. And do you think that the masses of people will think that there's not that much of a difference in watching the football game with the high-definition TV from an analog TV? Or
Can't wait to hear this.
Will the public see a difference between enough difference between high-definition TV and regular TV? Well, there are two things going on here. First, if you see analog television, today's television, next to a widescreen high-definition television that is properly displayed, and that's a big question, it is very compelling. I usually have an HDTV in my home for review, and I brought lots of people I know, and my profession is so full of skeptics that it's sickening. But I have never met a person who has not come in and seen this properly presented and say, wow. But even if you go to a store, Circuit City, here in town or someplace, and they have it set up wrong and it looks terrible, maybe just a little bit better, never underestimate the willingness of Americans to spend money on whatever is the new great thing, even if it isn't great. So I have real confidence that when the prices come down, this will take off.
One more question.
I'm Jay Gillette from the Center for Information and Communication Sciences. I'm going to stand if I may to get the question out. We were very interested in the Microsoft case. and this is something that you said that you were working on now. The case has closed its arguments, as I understand it, and so what is your prognosis of the outcome?
I covered the Microsoft antitrust trial. I was in the courtroom almost every day for almost a year. And for somebody interested in technology, actually, it's fun. Court trials are fun. It's a drama. I mean, the whole idea is to impress the jury, or the judge in this case, with a drama. Next week, we all thought it was last Friday, but probably this Friday, the first part of the verdict is coming out. It's the judge's findings of fact, his written record showing whom he believes and who he does not believe. It's half of the verdict. And I don't think anyone who has sat through this trial or even has the barest knowledge of it does not believe that the judge will find Microsoft guilty or liable on at least many of the counts that the government brought against them. That I'd be willing to bet on. But what will happen as a result of that, we don't know. The way things work in antitrust trials is that you aren't found guilty, you're found liable. You're found liable for a remedy. A remedy is a government-imposed solution to make sure that the illegal antitrust behavior doesn't happen again. The breakup of the phone company was a remedy. The number of remedies discussed for this case is as diverse as the software industry. Everything from asking them to rewrite some contracts to breaking it up into an operating system in an application software company. I don't think either. I think those are the two extremes, and it'll fall somewhere in the middle. Microsoft got penalized in an antitrust case in 1995 and asked to revise some of their contracts, and they just immediately went right around it and did some other stuff, which brought them in court this time. So I think everyone on the government side wants something that's called a structural remedy, something that changes the company in some fundamental way so that they are never able to behave this way again. But I think they will fall far short of breaking the company up, because everybody realizes that on the U.S. Court of Appeals in Washington and the U.S. Supreme Court, there aren't enough votes to support that kind of sort of liberal antitrust solution any longer. You've got to find something less extreme, more clever, and I think that's what we'll end up with.
Joel,
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much.